Well, welcome everyone to the second of our webinars in preparation for the upcoming election. I'm Patrick Malloy. I am the Dean of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and we're delighted that you're with us, and especially we are delighted that the Reverend Dr. Pamela Cooper White is with us today, although most of you know Pam personally. Those of you who are members of the Cathedral congregation will know Pam because she was a regular member of that worshiping community, both as a person who simply came to sit in the pews as you were, but also as a person who preached and a person who presided regularly. She was a part of our associate clerical staff. And Pam is also the Dean Emerita of Union Seminary, just down the street here. So Pam is well known to us. And Pam is certainly well known too because of her important work both in religion and psychology, because Pam is a clinical psychologist. And her book, the book that we're really discussing today, really is as much about psychology as it is about religion. And oftentimes, having read it, it's hard to tell where one began and the other ended. So we're delighted, Pam, that you're with us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's great. Today, during the conversation, there is a Q&A button at the bottom, and you can type questions in for Dr. Cooper White and me. No one else will see them. The comments section does not work. However, that is for you. However, we're going to put in the comment section now a couple resources that you may want to use. The first, it links you to a great number of statements of the church on social issues, and in particular statements of the General Convention. And when you go into the document, it will divide them up by topic, and then it will give you links where you can go and actually read the resolutions of the General Convention and also of the Executive Council of the Church. So here is that link. These webinars are going to be recorded, as you see, and then they will be made available on our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel can be found here. So tomorrow you will find a recording of this webinar there. Our hope in providing these recordings on YouTube is that these recorded sessions might be useful in your parishes or might be useful for those people who could not be here today to do the webinar. Our topics for this series are, in addition to this one, we're also looking at issues of immigration, reproduction, and environment and climate. And each of them wants to look at the issue not from a political point of view, but from a theological, ecclesiastical point of view. That is to say, our basic concern is to ask the question, what exactly has the Episcopal Church said about this topic? What are some of the sort of key headlines? And then to have a conversation with experts who are experts in a particular field, who can help us to explicate and help us to dig deeper into those various topics. And today we're going to talk about white Christian nationalism, the topic of Dr. Cooper White's latest book. So maybe that all being said, if you don't mind, I might begin with a little bit from the General Convention, and then Dr. Cooper White is going to run us through her research using slides, and then we'll come back and talk some more. White Christian nationalism was only ever mentioned explicitly by the General Convention at the last General Convention, the 2024 General Convention. Certainly it was alluded to any number of times, but it was only explicitly named as such in 2024. And this was the resolution of the 81st General Convention. Resolved that the 81st General Convention acknowledged the urgent, troubling, and deeply rooted issue of religious nationalism, the intersection of religious extremism and nationalist ideologies, both domestically and globally. And be it further resolved that the Episcopal Church, as part of the body of Christ, lament the negative impact of religious nationalism in promoting violence against the personhood and the social, cultural, and historical order of marginalized groups. And then later in that resolution, that series of resolutions, it actually names it as white Christian nationalism. It's no wonder that the church is finally being this open about this, given the political climate. But this, as I said, is not the first time this has been alluded to. I'd like to just give you one more quote, and then we can ask Dr. Cooper-White to tell us about her research. Soon after the shock of January 6, 2021, the General Convention or the Executive Council of the Church made a statement. And what's interesting about that is the very first sentence of Dr. Cooper-White's book, as you will see when you all read it, is this: on January 6, 2021, a violent mob attacked the US Capitol in a shocking effort to stop the certification of the election of Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. What's interesting is Dr. Cooper-White in that statement, that sentence says nothing about white Christian nationalism. However, the Executive Council, just 3 weeks later on January 25th, after the January 6th riot, said this: resolved that the Executive Council, meeting virtually from the 22nd of January through the 25th of January 2021, acknowledges and repents its past support for white supremacy and the sins of the church's past in being complicit and upholding white supremacist ideologies and systems. We are called to notice and remove these sins from our current and future church as we grapple with having benefited from these sins, and resolved that the Executive Council is alarmed that white nationalism is increasingly on the rise. Violent white supremacist groups are increasing in number. Those who that the Executive Council recognize white national and included like care direction. Jesus.
Pat, you're breaking up a bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I back?
Sounds like it.
Okay, sorry. So this is just to give you some research on this topic. And now we ask Dr. White to lead us through.
All right. Let me just screen share here. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, is that visible to everyone? All right. Can you hear me? Okay. All right, so let us go on. The title slide is actually the title of my book, and I welcome you to dive deeper with me if you want to read that. This is just a very short summary of the research I did a couple of summers ago, and it keeps changing and being updated. On January 6th, that was 2021, as we know all too well now, a violent mob did attack the United States Capitol, that sentence, in a shocking effort to stop the certification of the election of Joe Biden as president. Deep in the midst of the mob was a loose-knit band of religiously motivated individuals who subscribed to the movement called Christian nationalism. On display among the crowds during the attack on the Capitol were numerous flags and signs with "Jesus Saves" in bold letters. A photo that went viral showed a group of men before a, 8 or 9 foot high cross, one with his forehead pressed against it in apparent fervent prayer. One group among the mob called themselves a Jericho March, Christians blowing shofars, praying to bring down the walls of government like Joshua at Jericho. And if you notice on the upper left here, there's an image of a person who adorned her shofar with the colors of the American flag. This is offensive to Jews and to Christians in so many different ways. Those of us who were not caught up in the violence on January 6th, nor the underlying beliefs that fueled it, still wonder how can people, even those we consider good people, get so caught up in a web of lies? And is dialogue with them even possible once they've come to believe dangerous untruths that, if not addressed, can harm us all? I want to begin by outlining what Christian nationalism really is. A common belief among those who subscribe to Christian nationalism is that there has been a woeful decline in America's standing in the world because of the nation's growing degeneracy. And with it, the concomitant belief in an urgent call to restore the nation to its original goodness and a mandate to lead the world in godliness. The United States was founded, according to this group, by entirely evangelical Christians, based on a misreading of the much more complex history of the framers of the Constitution, and had God's special mandate to become a new Jerusalem in white Christians, mostly male, will rule over a nation whose laws are perfectly aligned with their own selective fundamentalist reading of biblical mandates. In my research, I found that Christian nationalist preachers tend to leap across the Bible from the Old Testament to the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, making scant reference, if at all, to the teachings of Jesus about love, healing, and justice. They jump from a highly selective reading of the Hebrew Bible that they believe supports the idea of a wrathful God directly to the second coming of Jesus in the end of days. In their interpretation of apocalyptic scripture, many see an avenging Jesus coming to wage spiritual warfare against the current decadent ways of America and the world. And as a just this week, a new research study from PRRI showed that among those who subscribe to Christian nationalism, 84% also believe that we are at a critical moment that is the end of times, and that we need to take up arms in order to take America back for God, essentially. It's their view. So those who hold such views, what they think of as the growing depravity of the current age, as evidence that the end of times is near and it is their duty to bring it about. Christian nationalist preachers exhort the faithful in sermons and song to take this nation back, even by force if required. So I do believe we're at a pivotal moment in the American experiment of democracy and also in the very character of American Christianity. As my research in the book shows, the term Christian nationalism really means white nationalism. The main tenets of Christian nationalism are that God established the United States as a Christian nation and therefore should essentially be a theonomy shaped by ultra-conservative Christian values, and a theocracy characterized by the headship of men over their households and white male leadership in the public sphere. Christian nationalists therefore oppose the separation of church and state, rather advocating for the display of Christian symbols in public spaces and explicitly Christian prayer in schools and civic gatherings. Now, to make a clear distinction, and this is important right up front, many Black church Protestants also align Christian values with politics, but to gospel-grounded social and political action for change, whereas white Christian nationalist agenda is almost entirely opposed to what we could consider to be social justice, and stand opposed to virtually everything taught in Christianity or Judaism about justice and compassion. Christian nationalists oppose religious pluralism and oppose generous immigration policies to keep out those drug dealers and rapists, as Trump infamously said, and to keep out Muslims and other non-Christians. They oppose abortion without exception, even in cases of rape or incest. They oppose expanding the rights of women, LGBTQ persons, with a recent rise in attacks on trans persons, and in a long chain of history beginning with the utterly denied genocidal founding of our nation, They oppose civil rights legislation and embrace laws that perpetuate structural and institutional racism. And we see that right now with voter suppression efforts. All of this is codified as a plan for the next conservative presidency, Project 2025, from the Heritage Foundation. Anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim attacks have been on the rise ever since Trump's since his first campaign as president. And both are on the rise again now in the wake of violence in Israel and Palestine. Some Christian nationalists also believe that eco-justice and addressing climate change is moot because the apocalypse is coming and this earth will be destroyed anyway. So let me be clear. Christian nationalism is a fanatical, radical departure from the teachings of Jesus and any faithful reading of either the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, and it is dangerously anti-democratic. Now, nationalism is not the same thing as patriotism. Patriotism is simply love of one's country. Nationalism, on the other hand, is defined as a movement to enforce or restore ethnic superiority of a particular group of people who identify themselves as the true-blooded members of the nation. And the United States is not the only place with nationalistic movements. Christian nationalism fuses this movement for white ethnic identity with Christian identity. Christians, both mainline or liberal and evangelical, have begun to sound the alarm from within the church about the dangers of Christian nationalism and its corrosive effects on both the nation and on American Christianity itself. Most notably now, an organization called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And the Episcopal Church was one of the founding denominations of this organization, and you can find them at this website. I urge you to look at it because they are always updating information. They have a wealth of resources. They have a petition that you can sign as a Christian saying you do not believe in these things. And they also are running a pilot project right now among non-conservative Christians in Fort Worth, Texas, trying to allow Christians who are like-minded around opposing Christian nationalism to come together and do organizing and education. Now, lest we conclude that Christian nationalism is a fringe movement of only a small percentage of American Christians, some recent statistics show that as many as 2/3 of all American Christians taken together, according to the Baylor Religion Survey, agree with at least some elements of Christian nationalism. And that doesn't just mean evangelical Christians. That also includes people like us who are mainline Christians. The most recent set of survey questions posed by the PRRI and Brookings Institute indicated that close to 1/3 of Americans, that's a smaller but still non-trivial percent, agree wholly, 10%, or are in sympathy, 29%, with the following statements, 19%. So a total of 29%. And then you see this green part of the circle. These are the people who agree with some of it, don't agree with other parts of it, are skeptical in general about it. And these are probably, in the green zone, the most persuadable to talk with about it. So these are the things that adherents and sympathizers and some skeptics agreed with. The US government should declare America a Christian nation. US laws should be based on Christian values. If the US moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. In a separate 2023 study, researchers found that Christian nationalists believe in a 7-mountain mandate popularized by Campus Crusade and Youth with a Mission, which claims that Christians should have dominion over home, religion, schools, business, media, entertainment, and government. That's kind of everything. In another recent study, 60% of adherents and 37% of sympathizers agree with the statement, non-Christians create immoral policies. So how do we understand this movement, which has now gained traction in civic, religious, and private domestic life? And because my field is psychology and religion, I focused on the psychology of the movement, namely, why and how do people get hooked on Christian nationalism and related conspiracy theories? I utilize both sociological and psychoanalytic lenses to explore the psychology behind people's vulnerability to being captivated by false teachings, both religious and political, and their personal investment in maintaining these beliefs. First, from a more sociological perspective, I've identified at least 4 conscious motivations behind adherence to Christian nationalist ideas. And the first is belonging. Now, this is something we all need. Evangelization fulfills the need for belonging and a sense of life purpose, heightened by the religious appeal to join a cosmic battle of good versus evil, with tactics that are similar and at times identical with cult recruiting. Fear of loss of white social status, resentment against a perceived, though still quite minimal statistically, loss of jobs and economic power to immigrants and people of color, and a desire to maintain or regain white supremacy and white power. And this is in the face of a reality that, according to the US Census Bureau, the year 2042 will mark the end of a white majority population in the United States. Now, many of us would celebrate that as a diversity that would enrich our cultural life in America. But for some people, whiteness may be their only key to identity and their sense of self. And for them, it is an existential threat. There's also a fear of loss of patriarchal authority and a masculinist hierarchy, both in the home and in the public sphere of work and governmental power, which is also related to an infatuation with guns that far exceeds any need for hunting or personal protection. And I'm going to say something about that a little more in a minute. And finally, moving on from these, really paranoia, an irrational conviction that Christians in America are being persecuted, as well as the allure of conspiracy theories such as QAnon, whose beliefs are now adopted by as many as 1 in 5 Americans overall, and a quarter of evangelical Christians, exemplifying what historian Richard Hofstadter called a long-standing paranoid style in American politics. And in this slide, you can see at January 6th, there's a Q flag, and then this poster board, God wins, where we go one, we go all, is actually the QAnon slogan, and God and hearts and QAnon. So there's a merger of this paranoid Christian fear of persecution of Christians together with all of the paranoid falsehoods of QAnon. Now, the 4 motivations that I just described are made explicit by individuals to varying degrees, but they are conscious to the degree that adherents of Christian nationalism would agree to them, even though they might use different language to describe them. Turning toward unconscious motivations, these involve the insidious subliminal pulls from the study of unconscious group dynamics, including parallels between Christian nationalism and the power of cult-like groups and their leaders, their narcissistic leaders, to make and amplify false claims, including the role of both mainstream and social media. The power of group persuasion is not something we're just realizing now. It's long been known by psychologists throughout history. Reeling from the atrocities of World War I, Sigmund Freud further articulated the power of the narcissistic leader. He wrote that followers unconsciously hand over their individual consciences, superego, ego ideal, their individual consciences to a demagogue who, with simplistic moral directives and all good versus evil political rhetoric, promises to restore whatever they perceive as lacking in their lives. And it relieves them of the burden of having to make complex ethical decisions on their own. Such strongman leaders exude power and protection. This ties in with the symbolic value of guns and a defensive hyper-masculinity, extraordinary prevalence of guns in the United States, a preoccupation that is shared by a majority of white evangelical Christians who own the most guns among any religious group in the United States, nearly half, and who fuse the Second Amendment right to bear arms with a skewed religious fervor for personal freedom. A high conformity group with a highly manipulative leader further can exploit individuals who feel wounded, whether by trauma or by envy, economic fears, group resentments, or by a changing societal landscape that threatens one's notions of tradition and even identity. Narcissistic leaders thrive on amplifying perceived threats and providing simplistic solutions. Appeals to nostalgia for a better, earlier time, usually fictional and benefiting only one ethnic group, can be wrapped in nationalism as patriotism rather than pure ethnocentrism. So the motto, "Make America Great Again," made this strong appeal to a glorious past that was never so glorious for scores of women, persons of color, and Native Americans. And the narcissistic leader can heighten this appeal by framing it all in terms of a religious cause. Such religious appeals invoke a battle of good versus evil in which fear is easily mobilized to hate. So taking all of this into consideration, and it's a lot, how can we talk across the extreme religious and political divide that has emerged from these trends in white right-wing Christian nationalism? Is it even possible? And if so, how? And if not, what do we do instead? I am by no means advocating a false peace via appeals to unity. Appeals to unity all too often gloss over or whitewash realities of racism and other forms of oppression, and they silence movements for justice and social change. So this is not, as the Hebrew prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel warned, crying peace, peace where there is no peace. But how can I really have a conversation across the rift that has happened in my family, my church, my community, because we've come to believe diametrically opposite ideas about faith and politics? I recommend a triage approach to discern if and when fruitful conversation might be possible and when it should not be attempted. And when dialogue is not possible, engagement in education and activism are the best ways to channel our own frustration and outrage. When it comes to a firmly entrenched Christian nationalist, we have to remember that we are trying to talk not only with an individual, but with their favorite news network, an ever-reinforcing bubble of opinion fed to them on social media, through algorithms sifting through their clicks and likes, and the hundreds or even thousands of members of their church, where they just praised Jesus and asked him to save the United States while listening to heart-thumping rock music and indoctrinating sermons. We're trying to talk with QAnon. So argumentation will not work. And if you take anything from this presentation, take that with you. We do need to walk away whenever we perceive that to continue in a one-sided dialogue that will either violate our own sense of personal integrity, continuing to engage in what we consider to be outright hate speech, or causing harm to ourselves because we're being subjected to verbal violence or worse. When fruitful conversation may be possible, how do we put a toe in the water? First, we have to ask ourselves, am I the right person to be having this conversation? Is this the right time? And is this the right place? Context matters. So if the answer to these questions is maybe yes, then there may be a yellow light. Proceed with caution. And that can be when we sense some openness in the case of a soft Christian nationalist who's not wholly convinced by right-wing rhetoric, and where mutual liking and trust are already established. For example, with a coworker, a neighbor, a skeptical family member, or a friendly acquaintance. And the only way in to such a conversation is to show respect and to listen, not pounce on an error in their thinking or immediately try to enlighten or heal them. I mean, who would appreciate that? Not to pounce, but to try to understand with as much empathy as we can muster what it must be like to be this person, to inhabit their life with its various challenges and stresses. Now, empathy is not the same thing as sympathy. It's being able to step into the other's shoes, at least to some meaningful degree, to understand where they're coming from. But by no means does it have to mean agreement. Green light is still always tentative when it appears that there is some real openness to re-examine convictions, but remember that it can always turn yellow or even red at a moment's notice. So there are lots of ways to become more skilled at dialogue that de-escalates rather than inflames. But first and foremost is that building and maintaining relationship always comes first by finding common ground, including shared values, and practicing respect and kindness. Much of what I advocate is being non-directive, making I statements rather than universal truth claims, and following longtime anti-racist feminist activist Loretta Ross, engaging in a process she calls calling in, rather than publicly and self-righteously calling out a person who has said or done something we find offensive. She reserves calling out systems. In other words, doing advocacy for justice by calling up structures of power. Committing ourselves to dialogue across polarization is not just add kindness and stir. It's work for the long haul. And I'm a great believer in planting seeds without having to see the final outcome. We may never know how our demeanor and our own ability to listen might shift someone's openness to find an alternative way of thinking. Finally, one thing honest dialogue requires is for us to do our own inner work of healing the split between our own desired purity and the mostly disavowed evil within ourselves, and withdraw our worst projections that we have placed on another person, demonizing them, before we can enter into genuine dialogue. Now, this is tricky because Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and misogyny and anti-LGBTQ hatred truly are reprehensible, and that's not just our neurotic fantasy or our projection. But if we can hold the badness of a conversation partner's beliefs together with a belief in the potential for basic human goodness, as we are made in the image and likeness of God, then we may not only have the chance to exercise the skill of empathic listening, we may also be heard. And I want to close with a quote from presiding Bishop Michael Curry, who remarked as Christians Against Christian Nationalism was just forming after January 6th, as followers of Jesus, his command to love our neighbors means neighbors of every type, of every faith, not just our own. Through our baptism and in our democracy, we are called to a way of love that creates a community in which the dignity of every human being is recognized and respected, and where all can have an equal say in the governing of our civic life. The violence, intimidation, and distortion of Scripture associated with Christian nationalism does not reflect the person and teachings of Jesus Christ. And so I stand with fellow leaders in the Christian community and call for a better way. Thank you for your attention. You're muted, Pat.
Dr. Cooper White, thank you for that. It was it was amazing how you took an entire book and condensed it into 20 minutes and did it so artfully. So thank you. And there are many ways we could go. I'd like to just something that's sort of autobiographical, and you know this. One of the things you mentioned was when people find themselves in church communities where there's a rift, where they have to talk across a divide. One of the blessings, although perhaps one of the curses of being a member of our cathedral congregation, is that we all seem to be of one mind, at least ostensibly. And I think that has to do with the fact that we are here in New York City, which is sort of a blue bubble. But I know it's not true for people in a lot of Christian communities. One of the points you made in your book that I found very interesting is that most white Christian nationalists don't belong to Christian community. That they're not people who are necessarily part of a denomination or even go to church on Sunday. And so I wonder if you could say something about where their notion of Christianity comes from.
Right. Well, that statistic has been contested a little bit also. Some other studies say that actually Christian nationalists do go to church, and it's up in the air as to whether that's true or not. And it also depends on how often going to church they're doing. But well, a couple of things to say. One is that I don't think people become Christian nationalists ideologically first. I think what happens is they reach out to be a part of a community. They want to go to church. They want to meet other Christians because somewhere along the line in their own upbringing, they came to believe that Jesus loved them and they want to get back into church life. And then they go to a church, and a lot of people, these days, it's not like our family has been Lutheran for 20 generations and I'm a Lutheran by God. It's people shop and they find a place that feels the most friendly and congenial. And so they go to a church, and what they experience is a fusion of praising Jesus and very high octane kinds of experiences that get their adrenaline going, and everybody's clapping and everybody's friendly to them, and they're welcomed into small groups and other kinds of activities, some of which are quite good, feeding ministries and other such things. But what they're also getting in the sermons and in some, really high production value Sunday services, they're getting a fusion of white Christian nationalism and right-wing politics together with all of the rest of what they probably came to find. And so they literally are being indoctrinated because these people are very artful. And there is a distinction, I think, between the people I would think of as followers of Christian nationalism and those who are the leaders of the movement, which is a kind of a coalition. For example, the writers of Project 2025, many of them, 35 of them, I think, were members of the Trump administration. Many of them also subscribe to Christian nationalism. And so there's this fusion of people at the top of this movement who want power and money for themselves. Kristen Stewart's book, The Power Brokers, is a great example of understanding that rather cynical coalition between business leaders, corporate leaders, and the leaders of the Christian nationalist movement. They don't care about really the welfare of the people. What they want is a movement that enhances their own ego and their sense of power and prosperity. So the followers, I don't so much blame them because they're being indoctrinated into an almost cult-like kind of existence in groups, sometimes very large groups, sometimes smaller. And so they identify as Christians because they have been indoctrinated as Christian nationalists. Whether they continue to go to church or not is sort of irrelevant to the way this has now become an important part of their identity. And there's a raft of media out there, like Dobson's, actually not new at all. Dobson's focus on the family that will teach you how to homeschool your kids, how to discipline them with corporal punishment, among other things, how to have a strong Christian family with the father at the head of the family, and then the wife, and then the children. And so people are encouraged to shun public schools where children might be exposed to corrupting influences and do these other kinds of schooling, or to go to a Christian school, so-called Christian school, not like the Cathedral school in New York, but a conservative Christian school where children are already being proselytized to and indoctrinated into this extreme version of right-wing Christianity from early age. So it's a combination, I think, of people who go into churches looking for something else, and then they get sucked in. And then there's other people who I do think come into it from the conservative political side, but they find themselves reinforced and supported by the notion that by being a right-wing political person, they are actually doing Christ's bidding because they're hearing all of this rhetoric. And for example, Doug Mastriano, who ran for governor here in Pennsylvania, where I live now, is an extreme right-wing Christian nationalist. And you can hardly tell his rallies from a kind of a megachurch style worship service. They begin with prayer. Trump's own rallies now are beginning with prayer and ending with this kind of altar call like experience for people that is fusing a kind of religious sensibility with a political rhetoric. But I'll stop there. I think that somewhat addresses your question.
It does. And you mentioned that oftentimes people go to these churches looking for this sense of belonging, which you mentioned during your presentation. One of our viewers, one of the members of the webinar today, asked a question that's trying to see if I can zero in on what this person is asking. They're saying because people are looking for this sense of belonging, in part, the last thing that we want to do is to shun them, in a sense, is to other them, because that, in a sense, only plays into their sense of not belonging with us, and therefore needing to belong with this other thing that we consider to be somewhat misguided, if not malevolent. So could you say something about that and about how I mean, it's really about your talking across the divide, but how do we avoid othering people who differ from us?
Well, I think that starts with us. Oops, we lost Pat. I think that starts with us. And that's what I was saying at the end, that part of my psychoanalytic understanding is that we all split between all or nothing, good or evil, perfect, imperfect. We all do that as a way of protecting our that we can have empathy with people's, even if we think very mistaken understandings, even if we can try to understand where they're coming from, I think that allows us to be more gentle in our responses. And being condescending, being patronizing, trying to convert them through argumentation, none of that stuff is going to work. But one of the psychologists who I appreciate in this regard is Jonathan Haidt has a book about the ways in which Democrats and Republicans all share, I think it's 7 basic moral values, but we lean into different ones more. And so folks who are conservative politically tend to value authority, loyalty, sanctity, whereas more liberal people tend to lean into fairness and care, especially. But what's interesting is that those traits tend to be more purple, whereas, you know, the loyalty and the authority and those things tend to be more completely red. So if we can have conversations about the things we do agree about, then it's easier to move toward areas that we don't agree about and begin to have a civil conversation about it, as opposed to just assuming that their ideas are all bad, because probably they're not.
Yeah. Do you think white Christian nationalism has much of a hold in the Episcopal Church?
Well, what we do know statistically is that somewhere around a third of mainline Christians, at least, do agree with some elements of Christian nationalism. And Amanda Tyler, who's the director of Christians Against Christian Nationalism, points out that this is not a new phenomenon in churches across America. I mean, if you just look at the fights that some congregations have over whether to have an American flag at the front of the church or not, the patriotic hymns that are in our hymnals, there is a way in which we fuse patriotism with religion that is a form of Christian nationalism, a very soft form of it. So it's like the ground has already been tilled. And if people are convinced that nationalism is actually patriotism, and love of country, then it's not so hard to make the intellectual leap to say, well, I remember the good old days when the Sunday schools were full and everybody sang the Star Spangled Banner, and it's like it all gets melded together. Christian nationalism really goes back to the founding of the nation, and it kind of wanes and waxes depending on what's happening in the country, in the political scene, and also it tends to get larger politically when there's a more anxiety in the culture, in the society. And so when anxiety ratchets up, people tend to want to come in and be more nationalistic and more isolationist and more nativist because they feel safe there.
You said something very interesting. You had two images. You had a wrathful Hebrew Bible God and then a wrathful Jesus, side by side. And sort of this apocalyptic Hebrew Bible, apocalyptic Christian Bible, and then there's this great wash in the middle. And I'm aware of the fact that because we simply have to read through the four Gospels in the course of 3 years, and lots of other Bible, we have no choice. It's just the way the church works. How is it, do you think, that there are entire swaths of the Christian world that simply miss everything except those sort of apocalyptic bookends? How is that even hermeneutically possible?
Well, if you don't have a lectionary, you can cherry pick whatever you want from the Bible to say whatever you want to say from the pulpit. And if you are a Christian nationalist preacher, somebody like Jeffers in Dallas, you pick what you want to preach on. And maybe you'll read it in advance and maybe you won't. Maybe you'll just riff and bring in scripture passages to support what you're saying. I almost wanted to say ranting about, because sometimes that's what the sermons feel like. They're very rousing. They're very rousing. And so using warlike imagery that they cherry pick and apocalyptic language. And also now they're very fond of a passage in Ephesians about fighting the powers and the principalities. But you almost never hear them say anything about Jesus's teachings. And so, and when you do, I mean, they might, I don't know, I haven't been to every Christian nationalist service, but they might pick up on Jesus is talking about the end of days also, or some of the apocalyptic imagery that's in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel. But they like to lean into that warlike imagery because I think to some extent, many of them really do believe that we are at an apocalyptic moment, and that if we don't make America great again and follow Christ's commandment to baptize the whole world as Christian, but let's start with here, that this is supposed to be the New Jerusalem. As Reagan talked about, the city on the hill. We need to restore America to the goodness that they believe it once was, which was actually never the case. And when you lean into the ideals of the Constitution and American democracy, they cherry pick there too, because they use the Second Amendment and the First Amendment to talk about freedom. But the freedom they talk about is the freedom to have your own way. It's not the freedom from oppression. It's the freedom to do what you want as a white male person in this society, which they feel is being taken away from them.
Yeah. Let me refer to something else that came up in our questions. And we certainly, having just heard about Black Nazi, this question is, how do I know? Yeah. This person also, how do you explain that there are non-white people who are white Christian nationalists?
Well, to some extent, I don't even like the term white Christian nationalist. What I believe it is white nationalism, but not all Christian nationalists are white. And it's a relatively small percentage of Black and Latino and some Asian people who also adhere to these principles. And it varies widely as to the motivation. Some of it may be the experience of having immigrated to the United States to see it as this beautiful place of opportunity and wanting to hold up that vision. And so they also may have a very evangelical or fundamentalist Christian perspective. And again, they're fusing it together with this sort of aspirational idea about keeping America beautiful and safe for them. But it's really a head scratcher how anybody could claim to be a Black Nazi. It's for one thing, just completely ignorant of history.
Yeah, it clearly is coding. I mean, it doesn't mean literally what it says. I imagine it's a use of words to signal so much more than what the words on the surface mean. But almost knowing the history, I'm not sure it would really matter, actually.
Yeah, well, fascism has many dog whistles that
Yeah.
people use. And I mean, there is a whole underground or not so underground white supremacist movement that may not at all identify as Christian, although some of their members may be. But there's you know, the Southern Poverty Law Center and the ACLU and others keep track of where these extremist movements are. And when a political figure says certain things that other people may just say, what's that? They will hear it as a call to action. So that's a different kind of extremism, which I don't necessarily associate with Christian nationalism, but I think there's, I mean, just looking at January 6th and all of the signage and everything, there clearly is an overlap. And with the warlike language about spiritual warfare, you can see how people could pretty easily slide from that into the kind of violence that did happen at January 6th, because they feel like they're on a holy crusade.
Yeah. Dr.
And not everybody would do that, you know, but there is a certain percentage of people who would. There's an interesting correlation in a new study about there's actually an instrument that measures people's agreement or disagreement with authoritarianism. And there's another similar instrument about their agreement or disagreement about authoritarian child raising. And some 80% of Christian nationalists also agree with those things on those instruments. So there's an authoritarian disposition that's baked into Christian nationalism. And that's why the leaders are able to manipulate people so well.
We have about 7 or 8 minutes left. I'd like to return just a bit to the General Convention. But first, I want to, you, in one of your slides with the seven mountains, a quote from Joshua, "This nation God is giving you as your own." And then there's the Reagan quote about the city on a hill. And that points, in a sense, I mean, indirectly, to the doctrine of discovery, that, you know, we Christians came here and God wanted us to have this. And I just, for the record, in 2009, the General Convention explicitly repudiated the doctrine of discovery. But I wonder, which of course says that a 15th century doctrine that says any country that a Christian finds a Christian can claim, because God wants Christians and not heathens to have control over everything. When we think of Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism, often we think about it over against Black people. But it's not just Black people.
No.
It's also, while we don't hear much about it, it's also against, for example, against Indigenous people. And I wonder if you could say something about the way this reaches beyond simply the white-Black divide.
Sure. Well, it certainly does. And also it gets into anti-Muslim violence. And there's a rise in anti-Semitism going on. And that's even before October 7th. That statistic that 60% of nationalists believe that non-Christians create immoral policies. I have found that just incredibly striking. I go back to the founding of the nation when I think about it psychologically, psychoanalytically. I think about the people who came here, the white Protestants who came here, the so-called founders of the nation, long before the Constitution happened, they're fleeing religious persecution. And in the 16th, 17th century, fleeing persecution meant trying to keep your head on your shoulders because you could be hanged or guillotined for having the wrong view, depending on what country you were in. So people were traumatized. They came over here, not a pleasant voyage. They came to a wilderness, not a pleasant place to try to set up homesteads. And they began to take over lands that had been already for centuries, the lands that belonged to Native Americans, while at the same time, once they got a little more prosperity, they were importing Black people from the Caribbean and Africa to be their slaves. And so that's what I meant when I threw out that line about the genocidal founding of our nation. We have to own that. And that's precisely what some people, in school boards and other places are trying to ban discussions about racism because they don't want to know about the 1619 Project. They don't want to think about the truth of the way we got this land in the first place. And so I believe, again, about splitting, we have to own the tragedy and honestly the sin that of that kind of all-encompassing totalistic racism. We have to own it in order to change it. And it's not to say that the ideals of the Constitution and democracy are therefore no good, but we have to be able to hold the ideals together with the reality of the history. And we're still dealing, I think, with the trauma of both the genocide of Native Americans and the genocide of Africans and Caribbeans who were enslaved before we can move forward into really fully living into our ideals.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a question to finish up, which I asked Mr. Suarez last week. Before we do, there's one of our companions on this journey asks if you can suggest a book. This person says that it further explores the psychoanalytic understanding of cults. I just quote, since you did not use the word cult, but this person wants to know if you can suggest a book.
I can't remember the title specifically, but Margaret Singer and also Robert J. Lifton have done a lot of excellent work on that. And in my own book, I do elaborate more about how there's a parallel between cult recruiting and what happens in these churches that are Christian nationalist oriented churches. But yeah, Margaret Singer is one of my favorite authors on that.
Well, thank you. And here's the question. So we, of course, would never advocate for any particular politician. We do not have partisan politics with a cross on top here at the Cathedral, but all of us hopefully will be voting. And so as an Episcopalian, a theologian, a psychologist, but in particular as an Episcopalian, especially with questions of white nationalism in mind, how do we faithfully approach the ballot box?
Well, actually, I'm not going to give you so much a psychological answer as an Ignatian answer. I'm going to go back to Ignatius's spiritual exercises, and there's a section in the exercises about making an election. And to summarize this, basically, he's saying, if you don't get a revelation in your prayer life about what to do, then what you can do is consider when you're making a decision, where are the fruits of the Spirit, your discernment of spirits? What is going to promote peace? Those things that Paul talks about, peace, forbearance, we could say justice. What is going to promote the fruits of the Spirit as the Gospels understand them and the epistles understand them, as opposed to a choice that would go in the opposite direction or feel morally like, wow, this is not a fit for me. I'm not comfortable with this. There's just too much that doesn't feel morally right about this. So in a way, I mean, Ignatius is saying, what would Jesus do? But to discern about where are the fruits of the Spirit most likely to come from the decision I'm going to make.
That is a wonderful way to finish up. So, Dr. Cooper White, thank you for being with us. Again, I commend to all of you Dr. Cooper White's book on the psychology of Christian nationalism. All of us here at the Cathedral miss having you with us every Sunday, but we're delighted that you could be with us this way. So, thank you
Feels
very
like
much.
home. Feels like coming home.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad. And to all of you with us today, please do suggest to those among your friends who would be interested in this perspective of the YouTube video of this webinar, and also perhaps suggest it to your Christian, like all of us who are approaching the St. John the Divine, and all of us who work and live and worship here. Seeing you next week when we will explore issues related to the election and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you.